Hello friends, and welcome to the UFOBBQ. My name is Ben, and you're watching episode 3 of my beginner barbecue series. In this series, I'm going to take you from the very beginning to the very end of some of the major cooks that we do on the smoker, and I'm going to show you in depth each step, what my reasoning is for each decision, and how we get from a big piece of meat to a delicious meal. Today we're going to be doing pork spare ribs. Let's get started. Okay. Before we get started, I want to remind you guys that this is a beginner episode. If you've cooked ribs before, if you're just looking for a new recipe like most of my videos, this is probably going to be a little bit too in-depth for you, but I will have timestamps down below. You can jump ahead, you can see what rubs I'm using, and just kind of my general feel for how I'm cooking. But I want this to be for the absolute beginner. You guys can come in here with your brand new smoker, you can follow from the very beginning to the very end, and cook them exactly as I'm doing them right here. Now, like all of our cooks, there's a couple of things we need to decide before we even begin smoking. Number one, we need to figure out how much food do we actually need. Number two, we got to figure out how much time do we need. And number three, we got to figure out what we need to actually make this thing happen. For determining how much food we're going to need, for ribs it's pretty simple. In general, I plan for a half rack per person. So if you're cooking for 10 people, you're going to need 5 racks of ribs. If you guys are cooking for a football team, maybe a full rack per person. But in general, your backyard cooking, I'd say about a half rack is usually okay. If you're cooking for more than maybe 6 people, throw an extra rack on there just to make sure you have enough. Now, as far as timing is concerned, this isn't the longest cook. Ribs are not as long as a brisket or a pulled pork. I usually plan for about 6 hours total. That's not including prep, but actual smoking time, about 6 hours. I like to put my marinades on or my dry rubs 12 to 24 hours in advance. So I will trim them today at noon, and I will plan to put these onto my smoker around noon tomorrow. And lastly, for what we need, pork ribs are actually pretty simple. We don't need a whole bunch of extra stuff. We need our ribs. In this case, we're doing spare ribs. Baby back ribs will cook a little bit faster, but you can follow the same kind of process, but you're gonna have to monitor them more. So we're doing spare ribs. You can get them St. Louis cut already, so they're a nice square, or you can get just the full spare ribs like we do, and I will show you how to trim them up. It's really simple. We're gonna need the ingredients for our dry rub. I'll have all that down below. You're gonna need your barbecue sauce if you want these to be wet. If you want them to be dry, you can just cook them all the way through and be happy. And you're gonna need your spritz. In this case, I'm probably gonna do a mixture of beer, butter, and apple cider. You can use whatever you like. I find that's a really good spritz, but there's a couple other options that we'll go over. We're gonna use a binder. In this case, it's gonna be yellow mustard. We'll have some of that. And then a good thermometer is always helpful. You don't need a thermometer to cook just about everything, but it does make things a little bit easier to know exactly where you are in your cook. So a thermometer is helpful. And then lastly, for any major cook, you're obviously gonna need enough fuel. I'm gonna be doing this on a pellet smoker, and the general rule of thumb that I like to go off of is about 1 pound of pellets per hour of cook time. Obviously, you're gonna need more when it's really cold and less if it's really hot. But since we're doing about 6 hours, around 7 pounds of pellets is probably useful. It's pork, so I'm probably going to use a fruit wood, but anything less harsh will be probably okay. If you're using actual wood pieces or charcoal, you're gonna have to determine how fast your machine goes through your fuel and make sure you have enough. Now that's an awful lot of talking, and I think it's time for us to actually get out our meat and start to do some trimming. As with just about every single one of our smokes, guys, the first thing that we gotta do is do some trimming. This is a full set of spare ribs. What our goal here really is to cut it down to about like that, which is the St. Louis cut. On this full spare ribs, there's a couple of pieces on here worth noting. This section right here is called the skirt. All this has got to come off. You can see nice flat cut, which is nice, which is where the butcher cut our ribs. Basically, there's another section here that we want to take right off the top. We actually have a little bit of the sternum on here, which is nice. And then there's a little section on the end we're going to pull off as well. But first things first, first thing that I want to do is I want to take off this skirt. To do so, we're just going to take a nice sharp knife and just get right in there, pulling it right off. Now all the meat that I'm removing, I am going to keep. You could throw it on the smoker while you're doing this, make yourself a nice little meal. Or you can grind it up, use it in kind of a burger mixture, which is probably what I'm going to do for most of it. I am going to try and get rid of as much of the hard fat as I can and probably not keep that. But I will be taking as much meat as I can, putting it into a bowl that's kind of off camera right now. But I will be keeping all of it. None of this is going to go to waste. It's all good meat. Just, you don't want to just throw this on like this. There's a lot of connective cartilage and stuff that's not very good. And there's some really thin parts that are just going to really dry out. So what we want is these nice, thick cuts of ribs that you're used to. The next thing I'm going to do after trimming this down is actually take the sternum off. On each of these ribs, at the very top, there's a section of cartilage. And what you can do is we're just going to get our knife in there and just cut basically right across the top here. We're looking for the top of these ribs, which should be about right there. We shouldn't be cutting through any bone. We should just be cutting through cartilage. So let's get our knife in there and cut right through it. Right about here. Actually, you can see it already started. We're just going to go square right across. Now with that sternum removed, next thing we got to think about is if we really want to cook all of the ribs on here. In general, these smaller ends are probably going to dry out more than everything else. So I'm probably going to take about 10 ribs, and the rest of these are going to go into my riblet pile, which again, I'm going to end up cooking, but I'm not going to cook them with the rest of the ribs because I think they'll dry out too quick. So I'm going to count about 10 back, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So about right here is where I'm going to cut right off, make it nice and square. Go right between the ribs, just like so. And that's looking like a nice rack of ribs. At this point, we come up to one of those sections where people have different opinions. As you can see on here, there's a little membrane. Some people, they score it and they cook their ribs really hot and that just kind of crisps up. Some people just leave it on and kind of eat around it. For me, I really don't like that membrane, so I am going to pull it off. And the best way to do so is take a butter knife, kind of get it underneath there. Just like so. I tend to kind of stick a finger in there just to pull it up a little bit. If you can get all the way across, that is ideal. Since this is a smaller rack, it's actually not too bad. And then you can kind of just pull it right off. Another trick is to use a paper towel. That'll give you a little bit of a, not leverage, but some grip, because everything is nice and slimy. So at this point is where I'm going to grab one of my paper towels, use that to get my grip, and just try and pull it all off. Just like so. That actually came off so much better than many I've done in the past. Quite often it'll rip and you have to get back in there and keep pulling it off. But that came off nicely. Now the last thing you can do here is clean it up if you're interested. All this hard fat you could pull off. I don't really like having fat on the backside of my ribs, but I also don't want to spend a million years here cleaning this up. So I'm not super worried about it. You could clean all these off, but we're not going for a competition. We're just cooking this in the backyard, so it's not a big deal. On the top side of our ribs, you can pull off some of this fat too. Just the really hard stuff I'm going to pull off. And just like all types of fat, guys, it's so much easier to do this when your meat is cold. Once it starts to get warm, it starts to slop around a bit. You can see mine's just been warming up from sitting out here. And it's already starting to slide around a bit. But we should be able to get this off. There's not too much here. Now, if you have watched my other beginning videos, or really any of my videos, you know that I'm a huge proponent of salting my meats before I put my rubs on. It's because I make my own rubs, it makes it a lot easier, and it's a lot easier to dial in the salt content of your meat. In general, I do about a ½ teaspoon per pound of meat, but these are ribs, so there's a whole bunch of bone in there. Maybe half the weight is bone. So in general for ribs, I actually go about half of that. I do about a ¼ teaspoon per pound of meat. These are somewhere around 2½, so that's really only about a little bit over ½ teaspoon total for the amount of salt that I'm going to put on these. Obviously, that is kosher salt. Don't use the same ratios with table salt. You're going to get very salty meat because we're going by volume, not by weight. So this is a good starting point. If you like more salt, you can obviously add more or go less if you're very salt averse. But I'm going to go with, like I said, about a ½ teaspoon total for these ribs. I'm only going to salt the meat side because obviously it's not going to get absorbed into the bone on the other side. What I'm going to do is just finish salting these up, put it on a wire rack into the fridge, and then once it is completely gone into the meat, when you see no exterior salt on the outside, we're going to come back and do the rest of our rub. A couple hours later, and you can see that all of the salt has been absorbed into the meat. It is at this point that we are going to apply our dry rub. This is really not necessary, and the more I cook, the more I realize you really don't need to use a binder. But old habits die hard, so I'm going to put a binder on here. You won't taste it, I promise. I'm not a huge mustard fan, so that should tell you that using yellow mustard is really not going to impact the taste of your meats. But at this point, we are going to coat our meat liberally with our dry rub. This is a dry rub I've been working on for a while. I'm workshopping it. The name currently is the SuperNova rub, but it's a coffee-based rub. Again, you won't taste the coffee, but it does add a certain level of savoriness that you don't find in other types of rubs. It also has a little bit of cacao in there. And as you can tell, if you look at the ingredients, there is no added salt. If you're following along with me, we put all of our salt on by itself before, which means that our rub doesn't want to have any extra salt in it. If you are using a commercial rub and you've skipped ahead to this point, just cover your whole meat with what you've got. I'm sure that the ratios are fine. But the reason that I do the salt and the dry rub separately, when you're building a bark, the salt is going to get absorbed into the meat, just like I showed you earlier. When you put your salt on here, eventually it's just going to get sweated into the meat and completely disappear. When you're trying to build a bark, that salt is going to disappear and it's not going to harden up. So if your goal is to have a nice exterior bark, salt is never going to do that for you. It's going to be your coarse pepper, your garlic, everything else. So for these types of meats, I tend to always do salt first. It's not completely necessary, but I also don't buy commercial stuff anyway, because I find that most of the time when you pay for a commercial rub, you're basically paying for salt. In general, don't forget your sides. There's a lot of surface area on the sides of these cuts of meat, so always cover your sides as well. Now for this particular rub, you can see there's not a ton of sugar. In the past, when I used to do the 3-2-1 method, I used to add sugar when I wrapped it. Since we're not doing a 3-2-1 here, there's going to have to be a point where we want to add some sugar in if you're looking for sweetness. You could add sugar in right now. You could put a whole bunch of brown sugar on top, and then when we actually put it onto the smoker and we start to spritz it, that'll kind of fall apart and go into the meat. Or you could just have a less sweet ribs, which is kind of what we're going for. And I'm going to baste these in barbecue sauce, so we'll add some sugar in at that point. And then potentially you could also add some more sugar to your spritz, but I feel like that'll kind of gunk up our spray gun. So we're just going to use the rub as is, and then maybe add a little bit of extra sugar to my barbecue sauce, but I don't think it's going to be necessary. As far as the rub, this looks good to me. Everything's covered, all the sides, and at this point it's going to sit on that wire rack in the fridge until tomorrow when we actually throw it onto the smoker. It is now noon on cook day, and I just put our ribs on. I have the smoker at 225 degrees, and we're gonna run at that temperature the entire way. Now, if you watch any of my stuff, you know that I like to put things on the top shelf. It's not necessary for ribs. You've got a nice set of bones in there that are gonna really deflect the heat away from the meat and give you a nice barrier. So you can put them on the bottom rack, you can put them on the top rack, you can put them wherever you want. The bones are gonna have a good level of heat deflection. Right now, I'm just gonna let them run. We don't need to spritz them or do anything when we first put them on. We're gonna let them sit, start to cook, and then when they start to look a little bit dry, that's when we're gonna begin spritzing. I'm gonna keep monitoring them, and I'll let you know when we get to that step. The ribs have been on for about an hour and a half, and it's starting to look a little bit dry. So it's time to begin spritzing. Nothing too crazy, that's about fine for one spritz. As far as what I'm using, this is an entire hard apple cider and about 3 tablespoons worth of butter. Heat up the butter so it mixes well, mix it all together, put it into your spray bottle, and you're good to go. We're just gonna keep spraying whenever things start to look a little dry at this point until we are done. As you can see, I'm also doing some burn ends, but for now we're focusing on ribs. Now our ribs have been on for a little over 4 hours at this point, and they're actually coming along very nicely. What I'm looking for, see that bend there? I'm looking for just a little bit more bend. See how it's breaking a little bit on the top? That's a good sign. See the little, how the bones are receding a little bit. We're starting to see a little bit of the bones pulling back. And then lastly, the thing I'm looking for is the temperature, which I don't really care about as much. In between these two bones, the biggest ones, we're looking at about 193. What that's telling me is these are probably gonna run a little bit longer because they're not bending the way I want them to. So I think we're probably looking at, if we're going by temperature, about 205. But we're at the point now where I think I can start basting. If you're doing dry ribs, just let them keep going until they're done. I'm gonna start basting everything down because I want to get some barbecue sauce on top of my ribs. And that bend test is really the key one for me. I'm looking for these to really bend a lot more. See how it's not bending as much at the end? I'm looking for just a little more bend and these will be done. I think these are gonna be a pretty quick rib. Usually about 6 hours is probably what I'm looking for spare ribs. For these suckers, I think we're probably gonna be done in about 5. So they're a smaller cut, but you're really looking for feel on these things. Okay, it has been about actually the full 6 hours I thought we were gonna have. And if you look at these ribs, you see how that pull apart right there? If we go around from the other side, you can also do the same thing. Look how these are just falling. They're much floppier. That test right there pretty much shows me these are ready to go. You can see them just almost wanting to fall apart. This is when I pull my ribs. If you want them to go a little bit further, you could do that and really actually have them completely full apart. But these are going to have a little bit less give, but they are going to be still nice and tender and fantastic. This is where I want my ribs. Really, this is the test that I do. This is the most important one. The wing flapper is what matters. You can see the cracks on the sides. You can see everything is just starting to fall down like that. This is where I want my ribs, and this is where I'm pulling them. So these are gonna come off. I'm gonna wrap them in tin foil because I still have about a half an hour before we're gonna eat dinner, but they're looking pretty great. I might do one more coat of barbecue right before they go into the tin foil wrap, but yeah, this is where we're gonna pull them, guys. These look pretty good. Now, as we were cooking these ribs, I actually thought that we were gonna end up doing about 4 to 5 hours at one point. They ended up going the full 6 hours. I'm really glad they did because they came out fantastic looking. The bend on these is really nice, and although it's a smaller rack, they do have a great give to them, and I think they're gonna be really good. Now, obviously, I did a barbecue baste on these things. You guys could have just done all dry rub the entire way, and they're still gonna be just as juicy and delicious, especially if you came along with me and did the same spritz. Now, all that being said, the proof is in the pudding, and I'm starving, and it's time to give these things a taste test. Oof, looks good. Now, guys, here's what we're working with. I'd say that looks pretty good, and I'm gonna give it a chomp. This is one of my favorite combinations in barbecue, guys. I love this coffee rub, and I love a good Kansas City barbecue on top of it. I'm so glad you guys came along with me as we cook these. I hope you guys are recreating this at home, and if it's your first time barbecuing, this is a great start, and I'm sure you're putting out some food that your entire neighborhood is gonna be really envious of. If you guys like this kind of content, most of my videos are actually a little bit less in depth, and I'm just showing you a good cook once or twice a week. If you like that kind of content, please hit me a like, subscription, comment, tell me how you do your ribs differently. Obviously, I'm very thrilled that you guys came along with me. Stick around for the next cook, guys, and as always, cook something fantastic. Take care.